Prague in the 17th century was a city of contradictions. To a traveler arriving in the winter months, it seemed almost like something out of a painting. The skyline was dominated by Gothic spires piercing the gray sky, their sharp silhouettes rising above narrow cobblestone streets. The Charles Bridge stretched across the frozen Vltava, its statues dusted with snow, while the sound of church bells echoed through the cold, still air. Lanterns swung in the wind, throwing patches of golden light against ancient stone walls, and the scent of roasted chestnuts and mulled wine drifted through the Christmas markets. On the surface, it was a place of wonder, of celebration, of tradition. But beneath that festive atmosphere lay something far darker. Prague at this time was no stranger to hunger and fear. The 17th century had already brought waves of famine, war, and disease. The 30 Years' War had torn through Europe like a scythe, leaving entire villages depopulated, families shattered, and food supplies decimated. Soldiers trampled farmlands into dust, and peasants who once tended crops were either conscripted into battle or slaughtered in raids. Those who survived found themselves struggling to feed their families with whatever scraps remained. In the heart of the city, bakers and millers became lifelines. They were the ones who could transform meager sacks of grain into bread, the most essential of all foods. Bread was life, bread was survival, and those who controlled it held a quiet power over the desperate masses. It was during winter that desperation reached its peak. When the snows blanketed the hills, crops could no longer be harvested, and livestock starved or froze. Grain prices skyrocketed, and bread became a luxury rather than a staple. Families huddled together in dark, freezing rooms, praying for a crust to share. The Christmas markets, in theory, were places of joy, stalls decorated with wreaths, vendors selling pastries and candied fruit, children marveling at carved wooden toys. But behind the laughter lurked whispers of hunger, and behind the music lingered the sound of empty stomachs. To many, the markets were a cruel reminder. Festive cheer for the fortunate few, despair for those who had nothing. Prague was also a city wrapped in superstition. The people feared the devil almost as much as they feared starvation. Stories of witches, demons, and monstrous crimes circulated in taverns and marketplaces. When livestock died mysteriously, witches were blamed. When crops failed, the devil was said to have walked the fields. And when people went missing, when bones turned up in alleys or by the river, the whispers were immediate. Some dark force was preying on the city. Against this backdrop, the line between fact and rumor blurred, and even the most grotesque tale could be believed. It is in this climate, this mixture of famine, faith, and fear, that the story of the miller begins. He was, to most, an ordinary man, a figure who blended into the background of the city. Millers were not beloved. In fact, they carried with them a reputation that stretched back centuries. They were often accused of cheating their customers, of secretly skimming off grain, of using dishonesty to enrich themselves. In folk tales, the miller was a trickster, sometimes even a villain, and in many European traditions he was linked with the devil himself. Trust not the miller, people would say, for his hands are never clean. Yet at the same time, the people had no choice. They needed him. They needed his mill. Without it, there would be no bread, and without bread, there would be no life. The Prague of that winter was a place where appearances could deceive. The glow of candles and market stalls disguised the desperation in the eyes of the poor. The rich feasted in warm halls while peasants clawed at scraps outside the gates. And the miller, standing at the center of this fragile balance, presented himself as a man of the people. His bread was said to be filling, even nourishing at a time when flour was scarce. At Christmas, when joy was expected even in the hardest of years, his loaves appeared at the market, warm, crusty, and surprisingly abundant compared to the meager rations sold by others. People lined up eagerly, coins clutched in frozen hands, believing they were buying not just food, but a small piece of comfort to bring home to their families. Yet in hindsight, this comfort was an illusion. For behind the smoke rising from his oven, behind the cheerful transactions at his stall, there was something unspeakable, something that would stain the city's memory for centuries. But at the time, no one could have guessed. To the hungry, he was a savior. To the city, he was a businessman keeping tradition alive in the bleakest of winters. No one wanted to ask questions about why his bread was so plentiful, why it had a richness that others could not match, why his stall seemed to thrive while others failed. Prague's beauty that winter masked its horrors. The spires and markets were a stage upon which the darkest of human impulses could play out. And the people, blinded by desperation, never imagined that evil might be hiding in plain sight. In a city where bread meant survival, no one wanted to look too closely at the hands that kneaded the dough. The story of the Cannibal Miller does not begin with a murder or with a scream in the night. It begins here, in a city dressed for Christmas, cloaked in snow, humming with prayers for salvation. It begins with the simple act of buying bread. And it begins with hunger, that oldest and cruelest of human torments. Hunger that can drive people to desperation. Hunger that can make a man a monster. Hunger that, in Prague, would turn bread into something far more horrifying than anyone dared imagine. The man at the center of this nightmare did not at first seem like a figure destined for infamy. He was a miller, a baker, a tradesman who dealt in grain, flour, and bread. His name has been lost in the haze of time. Records differ, and many historians debate whether he was truly one man or whether folklore merged multiple stories into one grotesque legend. But whether his exact name is remembered or not, the shadow of his deeds has remained. To the people of Prague, he was at first simply the miller, a man whose livelihood was grinding grain and selling food to those who needed it most. And in an age of scarcity, such a man could appear almost indispensable. The life of a miller was not an easy one, though it seemed outwardly respectable. Mills were noisy, dusty, and dangerous places. The great wooden gears creaked and thundered, grinding wheat into flour with an unrelenting rhythm. Millers spent their days coated in powder, their clothes and hair white as bone dust. Their hands were rough, their lungs often strained from breathing in the fine particles. Yet, for all their hardships, millers were never quite trusted. Throughout Europe, they carried with them a reputation for dishonesty. They were accused of cheating customers, of keeping a portion of every sack of grain for themselves, of being close with the devil. It was a profession already steeped in suspicion and unease. This miller of Prague was no different. He worked his trade quietly, maintaining his business at the edge of the city. His mill was situated near the river, a place where the grinding wheels could be powered by water. To his neighbors, he seemed ordinary, hard-working, even generous at times. He was known to offer loaves at the markets, sometimes at lower prices than others, sometimes with a quality that felt surprisingly rich for years of famine. His stall was a modest one, a table stacked with dark bread and rolls, the smell of warm crust drawing in customers who clutched their coins with trembling fingers. And yet, beneath this facade of respectability, something far more sinister was taking shape. There were small signs, if one looked closely. He kept to himself, rarely drinking in taverns or sharing in the camaraderie of other tradesmen. He was secretive about his supplies, never quite explaining how he managed to keep his ovens burning when others were forced to ration. Some whispered that he had hidden reserves of flour, that perhaps he was stealing from others. Still, no one pressed too hard. In desperate times, one learned not to question good fortune too loudly. What kind of man was he behind closed doors? That is the question that has haunted historians and storytellers alike. Was he driven purely by necessity, forced by famine into monstrous acts? Or had there always been a darkness in him, a taste for cruelty long before hunger struck the city? To understand him, one must understand the psychology of cannibal killers. History tells us that some are born with sadistic urges, delighting in pain and domination. Others are shaped by circumstance, driven by hunger, madness, or obsession until they cross a line that can never be uncrossed. The Prague miller may have been both, a man whose world offered him every excuse to descend into evil, but whose choices revealed a taste for it that went far beyond survival. One chilling element of his story is how he blended horror with normalcy. By day, he was a tradesman selling bread to mothers and children in the market. By night, he was something else entirely, a butcher, a dissector, a man who saw human flesh not as sacred but as material to be processed, cooked, and sold. The contrast is what makes his story so haunting. The same hands that kneaded dough also carved flesh. The same ovens that baked bread also roasted human remains. And yet, outwardly, he smiled. He exchanged greetings. He seemed, if not beloved, at least accepted. This duality raises unsettling questions. Did he feel guilt? Did he experience even a flicker of remorse when he looked into the eyes of his customers, knowing they were eating the bodies of their fellow townsfolk? Or did he feel pride, even satisfaction, at his deception? We may never know. But those who wrote of him after his crimes were revealed claimed that he showed little emotion, as though his conscience had long since withered. He spoke of flesh as though it were meat, of victims as though they were animals. For him, it was not a sin, it was business. The legend describes him as a man of average appearance, neither grotesque nor striking, neither charming nor cruel in outward demeanor. This, perhaps, is what made him so terrifying. Evil is often imagined as something we can spot, something marked by sharp features, wild eyes, or a monstrous presence. But in truth, history's greatest horrors have often come from those who looked entirely unremarkable. He was the man you might pass on the street without a second glance. The man whose bread you might buy without hesitation. The man who, beneath a layer of flour, hid stains far darker than anyone could imagine. Millers, in folklore, were often accused of keeping secrets, of hoarding wealth, of cheating neighbors. But this miller's secret went far beyond greed. His secret was the very food he sold. While others labored to stretch a single sack of flour into loaves barely nourishing enough to feed a family, his bread was thick, rich, strangely sustaining. And when asked about his supplies, he would shrug, offering vague answers that satisfied no one but silent suspicion. After all, who would dare accuse a baker at Christmas of foul play, when families were desperate for a single loaf to share? It was this mask of ordinariness that allowed him to continue, to go unnoticed for as long as he did. His life was a performance. The smiling seller at the stall, the diligent worker at the mill, the respectable tradesman who seemed immune to the hunger that gnawed at everyone else. Yet, in the shadows of his mill, he was something else, a predator disguised as a provider. To understand him is to confront an uncomfortable truth, that monsters do not always come with warning signs, that sometimes they were the faces of neighbors, tradesmen, even friends. The Cannibal Miller was not an outsider, not a stranger lurking in the dark. He was a part of Prague's community, a figure woven into its daily life. And that is what made his eventual exposure all the more shocking. For when the truth was revealed, it was not just a crime that came to light. It was a betrayal. The betrayal of trust, of survival, of the most basic human bond, the sharing of bread. And so the man behind the mill, the baker who fed the city, becomes something else in our story. Not a provider, but a predator. Not a tradesman, but a killer. His ovens, his bread, his very livelihood. All of it concealed a darkness that would soon emerge in blood and horror. Hunger is a force that strips away layers of civilization, exposing the raw desperation at the heart of human existence. In 17th century Prague, when the winter was at its most merciless, people began to vanish. At first, these disappearances were scarcely noticed. A beggar who failed to return to his corner, an orphan who wandered the streets and was never seen again, a traveler who stopped in the city but did not continue his journey. For a city accustomed to war and plague, loss was almost ordinary. People died in alleys, on roadsides, in their homes. Death was everywhere. But soon, the pattern of vanishing lives grew too sharp to ignore. The miller's mill stood at the edge of the city, where the river ran cold and the roads wound into the countryside. It was a place travelers often passed, a place where the poor might seek shelter, a place that seemed, to the desperate, safe enough to pause for the night. Inside, however, the air carried a different weight. The great wheel creaked with the endless grinding of grain. The smell of flour clung to the beams, and in the dim glow of the hearth, the miller's shadow stretched long across the floor. He welcomed the weary, offered warmth, sometimes even bread. To the hungry, his kindness seemed like salvation. But his kindness was a snare. According to legend, the first victims were drifters, those who had no families to search for them, no community to raise the alarm. An orphan boy, thin and ragged, was lured in with the promise of a crust. A traveler was offered a place to sleep, only to wake with the miller's hands around his throat. Once inside his mill, escape was impossible. The doors were heavy, the windows barred, the river outside too icy and swift to cross. In that dim, flower-dusty air, the victims disappeared, one by one, swallowed into the silence of the building. The killings themselves are described with chilling simplicity. Some accounts say he strangled his victims, quick and efficient. Others claim he used the same tools with which he worked, knives meant for cutting dough, cleavers meant for chopping firewood. However he did it, what followed was worse. For he did not merely kill, he transformed. The bodies were stripped, butchered, carved like livestock. Flesh was separated from bone, fat rendered into lard, bones sometimes ground or discarded into the river. And then came the ovens. The same flames that baked bread to feed families now roasted human meat. Flesh was minced, mixed with flour, baked into loaves and rolls that appeared, the next morning, at the market stalls. It is a horror almost impossible to imagine, the mingling of the most innocent of foods with the most grotesque of acts. Bread has always symbolized life, community, the breaking of bread together as a bond of peace. To take that sacred act and twist it into cannibalism is perhaps the darkest violation of all. And yet, the people of Prague, cold and hungry, bought his loaves eagerly, never suspecting. They tore into the bread with relief, shared it with children, placed it on their tables as a centerpiece of meager feasts. All the while, the miller watched. Did he smirk as they consumed what they did not know? Did he laugh at their ignorance? Or did he simply remain silent, as though this deception had become ordinary to him? Rumors began slowly. Some whispered that his bread tasted richer, meatier, than that of others. Some said it had an odd texture, a strange scent that was not quite right. But hunger silences doubt. When your children are crying, when your belly aches from emptiness, suspicion becomes a luxury. Better to eat and live than to starve while wondering. And so, even as whispers circulated, people returned to his stall, clutching coins, walking away with warm loaves that steamed in the cold air. Still, the shadows lengthened. Too many disappearances, too many bones found downstream, too many strange happenings near the mill. Fishermen spoke of remains caught in their nets, pale fragments of bone or gristle that had no place in the river. Children swore they saw strange stains in the snow near his door, dark patches that spread and froze into the ice. A traveler claimed to have heard screams carried on the wind at night, only to vanish himself days later. The first murders, then, were not merely crimes against individuals. They were wounds in the fabric of the city. People began locking their doors earlier, avoiding the road near the mill, glancing nervously at their neighbors. Yet none dared accuse openly. The miller was, after all, a provider of bread. Bread that filled bellies. Bread that dulled hunger. To point a finger was to risk cutting off the very supply that kept families alive. Fear and necessity wove together, binding the city in silence. Psychologists today might call this the perfect camouflage. His role as a baker shielded him. He turned the very thing people needed most into the cover for his crimes. And there is something profoundly disturbing about that. Most killers seek to hide their victims, to bury them in secret. But the miller displayed his victims openly, transformed into loaves, consumed by hundreds who never knew. His crime was not hidden. It was dispersed, spread through the population, made invisible by being everywhere at once. One can imagine the contrast of the scene. On Christmas Eve, families gathered in cramped, smoky rooms, clutching loaves of bread bought from the market. Candles flickered, prayers were whispered, children's laughter briefly chased away the cold. And on their tables, the bread sat, steaming, golden, innocent in appearance. They broke it, they ate it, they gave thanks. All the while, the miller's victims lived on inside them, their flesh unknowingly consumed as part of holiday feasts. The most joyous night of the year turned, in hindsight, into an unholy communion of horror. And yet the killings continued. The first murders did not satisfy him, they emboldened him. Each disappearance seemed to give him more confidence. Each loaf sold another reassurance that no one would stop him. He was no longer merely a tradesman surviving famine. He was something darker, a predator who had learned the city would protect him with its silence. His stall at the market became not only a place of commerce, but a stage for his secret performance, where he fed death disguised as nourishment. In time, the body count grew. How many died in those first winters is impossible to know. Some say a dozen, others whispered dozens more. Without records, Without bones unearthed, we are left with legend, with rumor, with stories passed down in hushed voices. But whether 10 or 50, the truth remains. His first murders set into motion a nightmare that would grip Prague with terror. The Miller's story, in this moment, ceases to be about famine alone. It becomes something else, something psychological, something monstrous. For hunger may have driven him to kill once. But to continue, to perfect the craft, to sell flesh disguised as bread at markets, that is not hunger alone. That is choice. That is obsession. That is evil. The first murders mark the turning point in his tale, the place where necessity ends and horror begins. They are the moment when a man ceases to be human and becomes a legend, a warning, a ghost that still haunts the streets of Prague centuries later. At first, Prague did not want to believe. The market, after all, was the beating heart of the city, a place where people came not only to buy food but to exchange news, to share stories, to feel for a moment that life was still communal, still alive despite the cold grip of famine. Every winter, the stalls filled with color, candles flickering, merchants calling out prices, the smell of roasted nuts and sweet wine weaving through the frosty air. Among them, the miller stood like any other vendor, his table stacked high with loaves. His bread was darker than most, heavier, but it seemed to fill the stomach better. Mothers said their children slept longer after eating it. Workers said it gave them strength. In a world of hunger, no one wanted to ask too many questions. And yet, questions began to ask themselves. People spoke in hushed voices of the disappearances that had grown too frequent to ignore. A beggar boy who had often lingered near the market was gone. A traveling merchant who promised to return the next week never appeared again. A young woman who had last been seen near the riverbank vanished without trace. The city had always lost people. It was a dangerous time, but now the pattern seemed to spiral around one place. The road by the mill, the stall at the market, the smiling figure dusted with flour. Suspicion first showed itself in small, uneasy comments. Housewives whispered that his bread had an odd taste, a strange savoriness that did not come from grain alone. Some swore they bit into gristle, something chewy hidden in the crust. A fisherman claimed he had pulled a human bone from the river, stripped of flesh, smooth as if boiled. Children, with the cruel honesty of the young, said his loaves smelled like roasted meat, not bread. Still, these whispers were met with nervous laughter, quickly dismissed. Who would believe such madness? And more importantly, who would dare accuse a man whose bread meant survival? In those days, millers already carried with them an air of suspicion. Folktales painted them as tricksters, cheats, even servants of the devil. But suspicion born of story was one thing. Suspicion that touched daily survival was another. Bread was too important. The city authorities, when approached with these mutterings, waved them aside. There was no evidence, only rumor. People disappeared all the time, killed by thieves, lost to plague, swallowed by the cold. As for the bread, taste was subjective, and hunger played tricks on the senses. To accuse a baker of such a crime was unthinkable. Better to let the matter rest than to risk panic. But the matter did not rest. The whispers grew louder. Families began to avoid his stall, some out of fear, others out of disgust. His smile, once disarming, now seemed sly. His loaves, once coveted, began to look darker, heavier, almost sinister in their abundance. Why? People asked. Did he always have more to sell than others? Why did his ovens never grow cold? And why, when so many starved, did he seem to thrive? Questions piled up like snowdrifts, pressing against the fragile facade he had built. The miller, sensing the eyes upon him, played his role carefully. He lowered his prices, offered bread to the poor, smiled at children. He portrayed himself as generous, as pious, as a man doing his part to keep the city fed. He went to church, bowed his head in prayer, dropped coins into the alms box. To many, this performance worked. After all, appearances mattered in a city that wanted stability. If he seemed respectable, if he seemed devout, then surely the whispers must be nothing more than slander. And yet, for every act of kindness, there was another dark discovery. Bones found buried near the mill. Dogs dragging strange remains into alleys. A merchant who claimed he recognized the belt buckle of a missing friend among the miller's possessions. These were fragments, pieces of a puzzle no one wanted to assemble. Fear made people hesitate. Hunger made them complicit, and the authorities, perhaps corrupted, perhaps blind, chose inaction. For in 17th-century Prague, justice was often selective. The city courts were plagued with bribery, and evidence was easily bought or dismissed. If the miller had connections, if he paid the right hands, perhaps that explained his protection. Or perhaps the truth was more unsettling, that those in power could not bear to admit such horror was unfolding under their watch. To acknowledge the whispers was to admit failure. And so the whispers were silenced with denial. But whispers, once born, are hard to kill. They clung to the streets, carried on winter winds, exchanged in taverns after too much drink. Mothers warned their children not to linger near the mill. Travelers were told to take other routes. A shadow gathered around the man, a shadow he could not shake no matter how wide he smiled. People spoke of seeing strange stains near his door, of hearing cries at night carried faintly across the river. The market, once a place of joy, became a stage of unease whenever his stall appeared. What makes this part of the tale so chilling is the city's silence. Everyone suspected, no one acted. Hunger made them hesitant, fear made them mute. Each family hoped someone else would confront the truth, someone braver, someone with proof. But no one came forward, and so the miller continued, shielded by a wall of silence built not of ignorance, but of willful blindness. Psychologically, this is one of the most disturbing elements of the story. It is easy to see monsters when they reveal themselves, when they act openly, when they wear their cruelty on their skin. It is far harder to see them when they hide behind something essential, when they clothe themselves in respectability and necessity. The miller did not just feed the city, he fed it lies, and the city swallowed them whole. His cover-up was not a clever scheme, but a simple exploitation of human fear, the fear of facing a truth too dark to bear. By the time suspicion turned into dread, it was already too late. Too many had eaten his bread. Too many had vanished near his mill. Too many signs pointed to a nightmare that could no longer be laughed off. The city stood at the edge of revelation, balanced between denial and horror. And when the truth finally emerged, it would be more grotesque than the whispers had ever dared to suggest. For now, however, the whispers remained whispers. The cover-up held. And beneath the thin veil of normalcy, the miller continued his work, his ovens glowing through the night, his hands kneading dough that would feed the city with death disguised as bread. The breaking point came suddenly, as such revelations often do. For years, the whispers had swirled like smoke around the miller's door, yet nothing solid had been grasped. People feared, people suspected, but still they bought his bread, still they turned their eyes away. It took a single mistake, a single misstep, for the truth to force its way into the open. The stories differ on exactly how he was discovered. Some say it was a child who escaped, half-starved, trembling, his clothes soaked with blood, whispering of horrors he had seen inside the mill. Others claim it was the river that betrayed him, its icy waters delivering up a sack weighted with stones, inside which lay the severed remains of a human body. Another version tells of neighbors following strange cries one winter night, pressing their ears against the mill walls and hearing what could not be ignored. Whatever the precise moment, the silence of Prague finally cracked, and suspicion hardened into action. Authorities moved in. The mill, once a place of industry, was surrounded. Torches flickered against its stone walls, soldiers hammered at the heavy door, shouts echoed into the night. Inside, the miller is said to have offered little resistance. Perhaps he knew his time had come, perhaps he no longer cared. When they forced their way in, what they found confirmed every whispered rumor and worse. In the ovens, fresh loaves still baked, their scent rich and savory, masking the stench of death. In the cellar, salted meat hung from hooks, pale and unmistakably human. Barrels of fat stood in the corner, carefully rendered and stored. And in the shadows, the remnants of his victims, bones, scraps of clothing, belongings that told of lives cut short, lay scattered like refuse. The scene horrified even hardened men. Soldiers who had fought in war, who had seen villages burn and corpses pile high, staggered back at the sight. Priests were summoned to bless the place, to drive out whatever evil had taken root within those walls. Mothers fainted upon hearing the news, clutching their children close, remembering loaves bought from his stall, bread eaten at their very tables. The city was in shock. For years, they had consumed death disguised as nourishment, and now they could no longer deny it. Dragged from his mill, the miller was thrown into the dungeons beneath Prague's old town hall. There, in the damp and darkness, he faced interrogation. At first, he was silent. He refused to speak, his face blank, his eyes unreadable. But the 17th century was not an age of gentle questioning. The methods of interrogation were brutal, designed to break both body and spirit. Some accounts say he was stretched on the rack, others that his flesh was torn with iron hooks, still others that he was pressed until his bones threatened to shatter. Whatever methods were used, eventually his silence broke, and what spilled out was darker than anyone had imagined. He confessed. He confessed to luring the desperate and the lonely into his mill, to butchering them like animals, to mixing their flesh with flour, to selling the loaves at the Christmas markets year after year. He confessed to choosing victims who would not be missed, beggars, orphans, travelers without families. He confessed to feeding not only himself but the entire city, his crimes hidden in plain sight. And as he spoke, horror rippled outward. Every word was another wound in Prague's heart, another reminder that evil had lived among them unchecked. But confession alone was not enough for the people. They wanted details, and he gave them. He told them how he strangled his victims quickly, how he bled them, how he carved their flesh with the same knives he used for bread. He described how he salted the meat, how he ground bones into powder, how he used fat to grease his pans. His voice, it is said, was devoid of remorse. He spoke as though describing a trade, a craft, a profession no different from milling grain. To him, it was simply the business of survival. The tally of his victims remains uncertain. Some accounts claim a dozen, others 2 dozen, still others whisper of numbers far higher. The truth is likely lost, for many of the bodies were consumed, their traces vanished into loaves eaten long ago. But whatever the number, the impact was the same. The people of Prague recoiled in horror, sickened not only by what he had done, but by their own unwitting role in it. They had eaten his bread. They had bought it eagerly, fed it to their children, shared it at their feasts. They had, unknowingly, been his accomplices in the final act of his crimes. In the days following his confession, the city seethed with fury. Crowds gathered outside the dungeon, demanding justice, demanding punishment as brutal as his crimes. The Christmas market that year was quiet, its joy extinguished. Merchants looked nervously at their customers. Customers looked suspiciously at their food, and everywhere, the shadow of the miller loomed. Trust was broken. Hunger had once bound them together, but now it divided them. Each glance at a loaf of bread carrying with it an unspoken question. What if? The trial that followed was swift. In those days, trials were often more performance than deliberation, and this one was no different. The evidence was overwhelming, his confession damning, the outrage of the people undeniable. In the great hall, under the flicker of torches, he stood chained before the judges. Witnesses spoke of missing relatives, of strange loaves, of bones in the river. Officials displayed the grisly evidence taken from his mill. And when the miller was asked if he had anything to say in his defense, he offered none. Some say he laughed, others that he shrugged. Some even claim he said he had done the city a service, feeding it when no one else could. Whatever the truth, his words only deepened the disgust of those present. When the verdict was pronounced, guilty of murder, guilty of cannibalism, guilty of crimes against God and man alike, there was no surprise. The people demanded not just his death, but his destruction. To them, his existence was a stain that had to be erased completely, a warning to all that such evil could never again be tolerated. The unmasking of the miller was not merely the capture of a criminal. It was the collapse of a deception that had wrapped itself around the city. It was the moment when whispers became screams, when rumor became undeniable fact, when a man who had seemed ordinary was revealed as something monstrous. His confession tore away the last illusions, leaving only horror in its place. Prague would never forget that night, when the ovens were extinguished, the bread turned to ash, and the man who had fed them revealed himself as their betrayer. The miller's story, once hidden in whispers, was now shouted in every tavern, every market, every home. And as the city prepared for his punishment, the people wondered what justice could possibly look like for a man who had fed them death disguised as bread. Justice in 17th century Prague was never quiet. It was not meant to be. Punishment was spectacle, theater for the masses, a living sermon delivered in screams and smoke. And for the Miller, now branded the cannibal of Prague, nothing less than the most public, most brutal display would satisfy a city poisoned by his crimes. His trial had ended swiftly, his guilt undisputed, but the manner of his death became a matter of deliberation. To kill him was not enough. He had to suffer, to become an example, his body transformed into a warning carved into the memory of the people. On the morning of his execution, crowds filled the square. Snow lay thin across the cobblestones, trampled into slush by thousands of boots. Merchants closed their stalls, children sat on their fathers' shoulders, and even the infirm were carried out from their homes. No one wanted to miss it. Church bells tolled not for mourning, but for judgment. The city that had once eaten his bread now came to watch him be consumed by fire, steel, or rope, whatever fate the judges had decided. Accounts of what followed differ, colored by rumor and fear. Some claim he was broken on the wheel, his limbs shattered one by one with an iron bar as the crowd jeered. Others insist he was flayed, his flesh stripped in cruel mockery of how he had butchered others. The most common version, however, says he was burned alive. A pyre had been built in the square, stacked high with wood, its black smoke already curling into the winter sky. To feed the city with human flesh was seen as a sin against both God and man, and only fire could cleanse such evil. He was let out in chains, his body gaunt from weeks in the dungeon, his face pale, but his eyes, so the witnesses say, remained disturbingly calm. Some reported a smirk, as if he were beyond fear, as if he welcomed the flames. Others said he looked through the crowd with scorn, muttering that they had eaten well thanks to him, that they were hypocrites for damning the very bread that had kept them alive. Whether those words were truly spoken or later invented, they spread like wildfire, feeding the sense that he remained unrepentant to the last. The priests walked beside him, chanting prayers, urging him to confess once more, to beg for mercy, to save his soul. But mercy was not a language anyone wanted to hear that day. When he mounted the scaffold, the crowd erupted, not in sorrow but in rage. Shouts of "monster" and "devil's baker" tore through the winter air. Some hurled stones, others spat. Mothers clutched their children tighter, as if shielding them even now from the contamination of his presence. Bound to the stake, the Miller stood in the center of his pyre. The executioner, hooded and grim, set the torch to the wood. Flames licked upward, smoke billowed, and soon the roar of fire joined the roar of the crowd. The heat cracked the air, and the stench of burning flesh rose, sickening and inescapable. People who had once recoiled at the scent of his bread now gagged on the odor of his body consumed by fire. Some accounts describe him screaming, his voice carrying across the square, echoing against the stone walls of the city. Others say he remained eerily silent, his head bowed, enduring his fate without a sound until the flames took him. In either case, his end was slow, agonizing, designed to mirror the horror he had inflicted. Every flicker of fire was a reminder, every cry, or every silence, another moment for the crowd to drink in the justice they demanded. And yet, justice in that form was never clean. Even as people cheered, even as they threw scraps of kindling to feed the fire, a deeper unease crept among them. They had come for closure, but what they found instead was another kind of nightmare, the sight of human flesh devoured in public. What he had done in secret, the city was now doing in spectacle. His crimes were being punished, yes, but in a manner that mirrored the very horror they sought to erase. By midday, only ashes remained. The pyre smoldered, smoke curling into the pale sky. His bones were gathered and scattered in the river, so no grave could sanctify him. No stone could mark his place. His mill was torn down, its stones carted away, as if the very building were contaminated. And yet, no matter how thoroughly they erased him, the memory lingered. The smell of burning lingered. The taste of bread turned bitter in people's mouths long after. That Christmas, the markets were silent. Stalls stood half empty, the air heavy with suspicion. Bread was left unsold, untouched. People looked at their neighbors with wary eyes, wondering who might harbor dark secrets, who might hide evil behind a smile. The execution had removed the man, but it had not removed the fear. Instead, it spread it, embedding it deeper, making it part of the city's very identity. Justice had been served, at least by the measure of the 17th century. The Cannibal Miller was gone, consumed by the same flames he had kindled in the lives of others. But in the silence that followed, a question remained. Was the horror over, or had it only changed shape? For the children who grew up remembering the day their parents whispered of bread made from flesh, for the merchants who avoided the square where he burned, for the priests who wondered whether evil had been destroyed or only dramatized, his presence never entirely vanished. The execution was supposed to end the nightmare. Instead, it became part of the legend, a story passed down in shivers and whispers. Parents warned their children of the baker who had turned hunger into horror, of the flames that rose in the square. And every winter, when the snow fell on Prague's cobblestones and the smell of bread drifted once more from the markets, people remembered. They could not help it. Justice had come, yes, but it had come dressed in the same fire, the same flesh, the same terror that had defined his crimes. The miller was dead, but his story lived on, etched in ash and fear, a reminder that sometimes, in punishing monsters, a society risks becoming monstrous itself. The flames of the miller's execution died centuries ago, yet his shadow still lingers over Prague. The city has changed, its medieval walls crumbled, its markets filled with tourists instead of starving peasants, its streets lit by neon rather than lanterns. But beneath the beauty of Prague's Gothic spires, the tale of the Cannibal Miller endures, passed on in hushed tones, retold as a warning, a legend, a nightmare never fully buried. Historians debate the truth of his story. Some argue that the account was exaggerated by frightened townsfolk, that famine and fear created monsters where none existed. They point out that millers in Europe were often distrusted, accused of cheating customers, of hoarding grain, of consorting with the devil. To call one a cannibal may have been the ultimate insult, a way to embody communal suspicion in one grotesque figure. Others insist the story is grounded in fact, citing records of executions, confessions, and testimonies preserved in old municipal archives. Whether literal truth or distorted folklore, the Cannibal Miller's tale became woven into Prague's historical fabric. But why has the story endured for so long? Why does it continue to grip the imagination centuries later? The answer lies in what it represents, in the primal fears it awakens. Cannibalism has always been the darkest of taboos, the boundary that separates the human from the inhuman. To eat another person is not merely to kill them. It is to erase the line between nourishment and murder, between survival and desecration. It horrifies because it is both intimate and ultimate, a crime that turns the body itself into food, that transforms trust into violation. And in the case of the miller, the horror was amplified by betrayal. He was not a savage in the wilderness, but a trusted tradesman in the heart of the city. People went to him for bread, the very symbol of life, of faith, of God's daily gift. And he gave them death instead. That inversion, that profanation of the sacred, is why his story still chills. For Prague's people, the legacy was psychological. Hunger had driven them to accept his bread, to silence their doubts, to swallow their unease. The revelation that they had eaten human flesh, even unknowingly, scarred the community. It forced them to confront not only his crime, but their complicity. Evil had not just lived among them. It had passed their lips, entered their bodies, become part of their very blood. How does a society recover from such knowledge? How do you ever look at bread the same way again? And so the Cannibal Miller became more than a man. He became a symbol. For some, he embodied the desperation of famine, the way hunger strips away morality until survival becomes the only law. For others, he was proof of the devil's presence in the city, a living sermon about sin and temptation. For still others, he was simply the monster under the bed, the story told to children to keep them close, to make them wary of strangers. Over time, his legend fused with other tales. In some versions, he is said to have sold pies instead of bread. In others, he murdered travelers on lonely roads and ground their bones into flour. The details shift, but the essence remains, a man who fed his neighbors their own kind. Each retelling adapts to the fears of the time, but the core horror is eternal. Even today, in the quiet corners of Prague, guides whisper his name on walking tours, storytellers revive him in books, and dark history enthusiasts search for traces of his mill. Though centuries separate us, the fascination endures, because the Miller embodies questions we still cannot answer. What would hunger drive us to do? How thin is the veil of civilization when survival is at stake? Could the ordinary person we trust, the baker, the neighbor, the stranger selling food at a stall, harbor unthinkable secrets? These questions unsettle us because they strip away the comforting illusions of safety. They suggest that evil is not distant or obvious, but ordinary, woven into daily life, hiding behind familiar smiles and gestures. Modern parallels only deepen the fascination. The world has known other cannibal killers, figures like Fritz Harman in Germany, who butchered boys and sold their flesh on the black market, or Albert Fish in America, who confessed to feeding children human meat disguised as dinner. Each time, the shock is the same, the revulsion immediate. And yet, the stories spread, books are written, films are made, audiences lean in. We recoil, but we cannot look away. The Cannibal Miller of Prague belongs to this lineage, one of the earliest, one of the most haunting. His story is not just about one man's depravity. It is about the fragility of trust, the ease with which fear and hunger can twist society. It is about the way communities remember their darkest chapters, not to glorify them, but to remind themselves of what lies at the edge of human possibility. And so, the legend survives not because of the man himself, but because of what he represents. He is hunger turned into horror, trust turned into betrayal, bread turned into death. His execution may have silenced him, but it did not silence the questions he raised. Instead, it ensured that his story would be told again and again, each retelling keeping the wound fresh, each generation reminded of the danger that hides in plain sight. Today, when tourists walk the streets of Prague in winter, they smell roasted chestnuts, mulled wine, pastries sweet with sugar and spice. They see the Christmas markets glowing with lights, laughter echoing beneath Gothic towers. It feels safe, magical, timeless. But for those who know the story, there is always a shadow at the edges. The knowledge that once, in this very city, bread sold in a market carried a secret no one dared imagine. A secret that turned celebration into desecration. A secret that still lingers in whispers. The Cannibal Miller is gone, but his ghost remains, woven into the city's fabric, into its myths, into its collective memory. He is a reminder that evil can wear the face of the ordinary, that hunger can corrode morality, that trust can be the cruelest trap of all. His ovens are cold, his ashes long scattered, but the story of the bread that fed death will never die. Because stories like his do not belong only to history. They belong to us, to our fears, our fascinations, our endless need to peer into darkness. And as long as people gather to hear tales of true crime, of horror, of the shadows that lurk behind civilization, the Cannibal Miller of Prague will rise again, told in whispers, told in firelight, told in the shiver that runs down the spine when the smell of bread drifts on a winter night.